If you've been following along the last number of weeks, we've been going through some of the first books of the Bible. And it's interesting that we've already gone through about a third of the entire book. The first 5 books of the Bible really tell us what God told the Hebrews that they should do. The books from Joshua to Esther tell us what the Hebrews did do. They weren't the same. The book of Esther is one of those books which is a little different than the other books of the Bible. It never mentions God by name, but it does infer him. And it takes place in Persia after the Hebrews had been released to go back to Jerusalem. Now, many people did not go back, even though God wanted them to. They'd established a life in the new country. Many of them had arisen to prominence in that country. And why leave all that they had to go back to a country that was devastated and in ruin? So many stayed behind. One of those people who stayed behind was a man named Mordecai, who had a position within the inner circle of the king. Now, the book of Esther is only a short book, but it has more twists and turns and plots than a novel by James Patterson. It has everything pretty well. It's an intriguing story. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he's often called, it's easier to pronounce anyway, was ruler of probably the biggest empire the world had ever known up to that time. And he was throwing a large party which went on for half a year for the princes of his dominions. One of the biggest things that came out of this was his pride in everything that he had, including his wife. And he wanted to display his wife in apparently unseeming way before the princes of his kingdoms. She refused. So he dethroned her and went looking for a new queen. This Mordecai had a niece by the name of Esther, who was one of the ones who was summoned to become a candidate for queen. This took place over 4 years. And she was accepted as queen. No one knew that she was a Jew at the time. Mordecai was able, during the course of his presence, to unravel a plot to kill the king. He related it to Esther, who was now queen, and the plot was overthrown. But Mordecai was never recognized for this. Because of the plotters being overthrown, another man by the name of Haman was raised to a position of leadership. He was a descendant of Agag, of the Amalekites, who were sworn enemies of the Jews. And because Mordecai would not bow down to him, he enlisted a plot to get rid of all of the Jews in the kingdom. This was the first time that an extermination or genocide of the Jews was planned. It wasn't to be the last. Anyway, Mordecai was fairly upset by this, so he enlisted the aid of Esther to go to the king to try to get him to undo the decree to kill all the Jews that Haman had had him sign. I told you it's complicated. Anyway, Esther devised a plan to have a banquet with herself, the king, and Haman. But the first time they met, she apparently got cold feet and didn't say anything. So she had planned another meeting or banquet the following night. Haman was even more encouraged because he thought, being the only one invited to the king and queen, he must be really in good favor. So he planned a gallows from which to hang Mordecai once this decree was put through. The next night, the king couldn't sleep, so he asked for a book to be brought to him. And the book that was brought to him happened to be the Chronicles, relaying what Mordecai had done to save his life from the plot previously. So when Haman came the next day asking about the favors that he was going to receive from the king told him what he was going to give to Mordecai. And when Esther gave him the plot to kill all the Jews, the king hanged Haman instead of Mordecai. Now this is rather a complicated story, and it has nothing to do with the kingship that you might expect, but there are a number of points that should be brought out. And what it does is show how God works behind the scenes to bring about what he envisages himself. Because there's no direct inference of God working directly in any of the story. But one of the first things is the pride that people have. The king was so proud of his belongings and of his wife and what she would do for him that when she refused, he dethroned her for that one thing, even though what she refused to do was something she should have refused to do. Haman was so proud that he was going to be the greatest person in the kingdom and get rid of all the Jews that he lost his life because of his pride. It says in Proverbs, pride goes before a fall. And this is one illustration. The second thing is that it says that if you acknowledge me, Christ, before man, then I will acknowledge you before my Father. But there is a time and a place for this. It doesn't mean that you should go in every street corner and yell out, acknowledge Christ. There's a time and a place. And this illustrates this because Esther went to be queen, not denying, but not revealing that she was a Jew. If she had, she never would have been in that position. And if she had not been in that position, she would not be in a position to save her people later on. So there was a time to deny or to refuse to recognize what she really was. There was a time to hide the fact that she was a Jew because it was necessary so this could be brought out at a better time later on. So even though we're told to always acknowledge Christ before men, means we have to be somewhat selective in how and when we do it. The third thing is that Mordecai was a Jew. He heard a plot to overthrow the king. And you would think he would have been somewhat reticent to reveal that plot, because after all, the king was a sworn enemy. But he didn't. He told of the plot to overthrow the king, and ultimately was rewarded for it. It tells us in 1 Peter to fear God, but to honor the king. Even though we disagree with what's going on, we should always give respect to those people who are doing it, insofar as they deserve respect. And when you see some of the stuff that goes on during elections in this country and south of the border, you can understand how this is often not done. Even though we may not agree with the policies that governments put in, or agree with what they do, or agree with what they stand for, they still should be treated with the respect that they deserve as government. And we have to always remember that sometimes by honoring that, fearing God but honoring the people in power, what is accomplished later on may be even greater than what's accomplished by criticizing them too strongly now. And the fourth thing that I want to mention is the fact that Esther, Mordecai, throughout this whole process, did this in faith. No one knew what the outcome would be from one step to another. If Esther had not been chosen to be queen, then she probably would have been relegated to one of the concubines, living somewhere in isolation in a palace, never seeing her uncle, never seeing her relatives again, probably never even seeing the king. But she took it in faith that she might be elected. She took it in faith that she could reveal the plot that she was supposed to reveal. She took it in faith that the king would do the right thing, but not knowing one step ahead of the other. It says that in Abraham's time, Abraham was told by faith to leave his country and go where God would lead him. Noah was told by faith to build an ark, not having ever seen rain or having ever heard of a flood, and in the views of mockery of the people around him. We are often told to do things, not knowing the outcome, not knowing where one step will lead to the next. True faith is accepting the step that God provides and leaving the further steps in His direction. Only then will His true purposes be accomplished. Esther did this and saved the lives of her countrymen. Who knows what may happen if we do it and leave the rest to God? Something to think about.